Sim Aero Training's ERJ briefing for Simulator Session 1 before takeoff. In this briefing, we will cover cockpit prep on entering, done by the first officer, the internal safety inspection, also done by the first officer, the power-up, done by the first officer with the captain's permission, and lastly, the before start flows, including the departure briefing, instrument cross-check and safety briefing. The cockpit is divided into 3 areas. Area 1, 2 and 3. Cockpit prep on entering. Check that the 4 gear pins are on board. Check the crew's oxygen. Check the CBs behind the crew seats. Check the safety equipment in the back of the crew seats. And lastly, check the overhead CBs. The internal safety inspection. You will start in Area 1. You will start from the outside of Area 1 and work your way in towards the center. Check the captain's safety equipment and then his O2 mask. You will then check for any damaged equipment, breakages and abnormalities through Area 1. Check the first officer's safety equipment and then his O2 mask. Check that the gear lever is down and that the control disconnect levers are in. Check that the gust lock is locked. The thrust levers must be set to idle. Flap 0. The speed brake must be closed. Check that the park brake is set. Lastly, all guarded push buttons must be guarded and in. You will then move on to Area 2. Set the captain's display controls onto bright. Check that the captain's radar is off. Then, check that the first officer's radar is off. Set the first officer's display controls to bright. Lastly, Area 3 is inspected. Area 3 is divided into 5 sections. Section 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. You will start at the top of each section and work your way down. Do not miss anything. Area 3, Section 1. The 4 generator push buttons must be pushed in. The GPU is as required. APU button is pushed in. The essential power guarded button must be guarded and out. The battery switches are off. The bus ties and shed buses on auto. The AC power backup pushed in. Avionics master 1 and 2 pushed out. The emergency lights must be off. The overhead light control must be set to its maximum. Area 3, Section 2. The fire handle 1 must be pushed in. The fuel pump power switches are off. All light switches must be off. Area 3, Section 3. All guarded switches must be guarded and out. The APU master switch must be off. Ignition switches are on auto. Start-stop switches 1 and 2 are both off, and all lights must be switched off. Area 3, Section 4. Fire handle 2 must be pushed in. The power control switches must also be pushed in. Hydraulic guarded control switches must be guarded and out. The hydraulic electric pumps must be off. And all light switches must be off. Area 3, Section 5. All ice protection switches are pushed in, except the windshield anti-ice switch. This switch is to be pushed out. The ice protection override must be on auto. The aircon temp controls must be set to 10 o'clock. The recirc button must be pushed in, and the gasper button must also be pushed in. Packs 1 and 2 must be pushed out. Engine bleed 1, APU bleed and engine bleed 2 must all be pushed out. The windscreen wiper switches are off. Power up. The power up is done using Area 3 only. Area 3, Section 1. Battery switches must be switched on. The oral unit will then confirm OK. Avionics Master 1 must be on. Emergency light must be set to arm. You will then jump to Area 1. Check the oil levels on the takeoff page and check that the battery voltage is 24 volts on the electronic page on MFD2. You will then jump back to Area 3, Section 1. The Avionics Master 1 must be switched off. Next is Area 3, Section 2. The fuel pump power 2 must be on. The nav light must also be on. Area 3, Section 3. You will now conduct the fire detection test. You will press the button for 2 to 10 seconds. The fire bell will sound. The bagger exit and fire handle will light up. Both the master warning and caution buttons will flash. You will then get 5 ICAS messages, 3 of which are warnings and 2 of which are cautions. The 3 warnings are as follows: Engine 1 and 2 fire, APU fire and bag smoke. The 2 cautions are as follows: Engine 1 and 2 fire detection fail and APU fire detection fail. You will then switch the APU on. Wait for 5 amber flashes on the ICAS screen in the APU section. Hold the APU for 3 seconds to start. Jump back to Area 3, Section 1. The Avionics Master 1 and 2 must now be switched on. Select the shed buses to override. You will now start the stopwatch. Area 3, Section 4. No smoking signs must be switched on. The dome light must also be switched on. Area 3, Section 5. Conduct the ice protection test. Once the stopwatch has reached 3 minutes, set the environmental system to L and open. The before start flows. Please note that the captain and the first officer conduct their before start flows simultaneously. However, they are shown separately for learning purposes. By this time, the captain is inside the aircraft, positioned in his seat, and will conduct the following before start flows. He will start in Area 1. He will start from the outside and work his way in towards the center. He will conduct his O2 test. He will then check the AHRS switching, check the reversion panel, check and set his own PFD as far as is currently possible, check and set his MFD including the takeoff page and weather selection. He will set the standby instruments. He will check that the ELT is armed. He will unlock the gust lock and leave the gust lock unlocked for the first officer autopilot check. He will perform the SPS check, confirm that the speed brake is closed, and confirm that the park brake is set. The 3 trims will then be tested and set. He will then set the autopilot roll control check and check that it is in centered detent. He will then set the pressurization panel. Lastly, he will switch the FMSs on. The captain will now move on to Area 2. He will adjust the display lighting as necessary. Set the radar to test. Set nav1 selector to nav1 and set nav2 selector to nav2. He will set the RA selector to 0. There will therefore be no display. He will then jump back to Area 1. He will check the radar test pattern on MFD1. Once this is done, he will jump back to Area 2. He will set the radar to standby. He will set the FGS as required. The captain's before start flows are now complete. The first officer will now conduct the following before start flows. He will start in Area 1. He will start from the outside and work his way in towards the center. He will conduct his O2 test. Check the AHARS switching, check the reversion panel. He will then check and set his own PFD. He will then check and set his own MFD, including the fuel page and weather selection. He will reconfirm that the gear is down. He will then move on to Area 2. He will adjust the display lighting as necessary. Set his radar to test. He will then set nav 1 selector to nav 1 and nav 2 selector to nav 2. He will set the RA selector to 0. There will therefore be no display. He will press to test the IC600. He will jump to Area 1. He will check the radar test pattern on MFD 1. Once this is done, he will jump back to Area 2. He will set his radar to standby. He will check and set the FGS and autopilot test as required. He will lock the gust lock. Please note that only the first officer conducts the before start flows in Area 3. Area 3, Section 1. The first officer will test the CVR. He will then test the PBLT. Area 3, Section 2. He will conduct the fuel panel test. The first officer will jump to Area 1. He will select hydraulics on MFD 1. Once this has been done, he will jump back to Area 3, Section 3. He will set the takeoff data if the temperature is available. Area 3, Section 4. He will test the electric hydraulic pumps and select Off. The first officer's before start flows are now complete. You will now attain the departure clearance from air traffic control. The flying pilot will conduct the departure briefing from the Jeppesen plate and call the instrument cross-check. The first officer is to set the RMU as required for departure clearance. The captain and the first officer will set the PFDs with the departure clearance. The captain and the first officer will set the FMS with the departure clearance. The captain will now conduct the safety briefing. Sim Aero Training's ERJ briefing for Simulator Session 1, the Flight Guidance System. The objective of this session is to use the flight guidance system as many times as possible. This session requires 37 actions in 2 hours. A total of 74 actions will be completed on the flight guidance system in one 4-hour session. You are therefore expected to be knowledgeable with regards to the working of the flight guidance system by the second session. Jeppesen revision. You will encounter abbreviations such as Romeo India Victor, Charlie Tango Victor, and Charlie Tango India. These are known as VORs. A VOR is a very high-frequency omnidirectional range that transmits signals from all directions. These signals are known as radials. The first session will be conducted out of Cape Town International Airport. We will be making use of Standard Instrument Departure Octet 1A. Octet is a waypoint, a specified geographical location used to define an area navigation route or the flight path of an aircraft employing area navigation. Lining up for takeoff. The flying pilot will advance the thrust levers to the takeoff position. He will then request the monitoring pilot to check the thrust. The monitoring pilot will subsequently check the thrust as per the flying pilot's request. Please note that if the flying pilot is the first officer, he may not have his hands on the thrust lever. The thrust lever belongs to the captain on takeoff. The monitoring pilot calls 80 knots. The flying pilot says checked. The monitoring pilot then calls V1, then rotate. The flying pilot subsequently rotates the aircraft. On runway track 01, proceed on runway heading Charlie Tango Victor 3 DME. Takeoff and climb. The monitoring pilot will call positive climb once confirmed on the altimeter. The flying pilot will call gear up. The monitoring pilot will call 400 feet. Please note that out of Cape Town, 400 feet is equal to 550 feet as the airfield is 150 feet above sea level. Please also note that at 400 feet, you are to use your barometric altimeter and not your radio altimeter. The flying pilot will call heading or nav. He will call heading if the aircraft is being flown manually, or he will call nav if the aircraft is being flown using the FMS. Please note that every change on the flight guidance system is to be called. When heading is selected, we say heading green. When nav is armed, you call VOR white, and when it is on the radial, you call VOR green. The monitoring pilot will call acceleration altitude at 1150 feet on the barometric altimeter. Please note that 1150 feet on the barometric altimeter is equal to 1000 feet above the ground. The flying pilot will call climb sequence. The monitoring pilot will then conduct the climb sequence as follows. Check airspeed is sufficient for flap retraction. Retract the flaps to 0. Select the climb thrust and select the speed and set it to 210 knots. As the aircraft approaches 3 DME, the monitoring pilot will call approaching 3 DME. The flying pilot will say set heading 330. The monitoring pilot will subsequently set the heading as per the flying pilot's instruction. Please note that if autopilot has already been engaged, the flying pilot will set his own heading as the flight guidance system belongs to the flying pilot when autopilot is engaged. The flying pilot will request that nav be armed. The monitoring pilot will then call nav armed. The flying pilot will call VOR white. VOR will then go green and the flying pilot will subsequently call VOR green. Please note that every single change on the FMA is called by the flying pilot. The aircraft will then turn left on heading 330 to intercept radial 354 from Charlie Tango Victor. As the aircraft approaches 8 DME, the monitoring pilot will call approaching 8 DME. The flying pilot will then say select heading, set heading 060. The monitoring pilot will subsequently set the heading as per the flying pilot's instructions. Remember that if autopilot is engaged, the flying pilot will set his own heading. Throughout the rest of this session, as well as the duration of your training, you must remember the phrase sources and courses. Source refers to where your radial comes from. These are your various VORs. Course refers to which specific radial. Our current source is VOR Charlie Tango Victor, and our current course is radial 354. However, we desire to be on the following source and course. Source, VOR Romeo India Victor, and course, radial 090. As a result, the flying pilot requests that the RMUs be tuned to Romeo India Victor and the course bars be set to 090. Please note that if autopilot is engaged, the flying pilot will set his own course bars. The monitoring pilot will tune the RMUs. Please note that although the flying pilot sets his own course bars once autopilot has been engaged, the tuning of the RMUs is only done by the monitoring pilot. This is due to the fact that the RMUs do not form part of the flight guidance system. The flying pilot will request that nav be armed. The monitoring pilot will then call nav armed. The flying pilot will call VOR white. VOR will then go green, and the flying pilot will subsequently call VOR green. You will now turn right on heading 060 to intercept radial 090 from Romeo India Victor. You will fly outbound towards 22 DME. The monitoring pilot will then call approaching 22 DME. The monitoring pilot will then turn the aircraft towards Octed. On climb out, the monitoring pilot will complete the following: the after takeoff checks, as well as call ATC on the given frequency while passing the given altitude. The monitoring pilot will then call transition altitude. Both pilots will go to a standard setting on the altimeter. The flying pilot will call the altimeter cross-check. The monitoring pilot will check and subsequently call checked. Passing 10,000 feet, the monitoring pilot will call the 10,000 feet checks, which is part of the after takeoff checklist. The monitoring pilot will then say, after takeoff checklist complete, cruise checklist next. Approaching flight level 150, the flying pilot will call approaching cruise of flight level 150 Azel White. The monitoring pilot will call checked. This concludes the departure. Other general flying towards Octed will be done as per the instructor's instruction. We will now be heading back to Cape Town to conduct ILS approach for runway 01. For your ease of reference, we have superimposed ILS runway 01 onto standard instrument departure Octed 1A. Before returning to Cape Town, you have to ascertain, can you return? This decision is based on the weather. You will therefore obtain the weather. The flying pilot will call for the RMUs to be tuned to Charlie Tango Victor. Remember, sources and courses. You have been asked to fly back to Cape Town. However, your current source is Romeo India Victor. Your source therefore needs to be changed to Charlie Tango Victor. The monitoring pilot will tune the RMUs appropriately. Remember that the tuning of the RMUs is always done by the monitoring pilot, as they do not form part of the flight guidance system. You will then calculate the landing weight and set the speeds. The monitoring pilot will conduct the descent checklist. Descent will be given at 5,000 feet to Charlie Tango Victor. Please note that you want to be overhead the beacon at 6,000 feet, descending to 5,000 feet, so that leveling off is not necessary. Please note that calculating your descent is done as follows. You are currently at 15,000 feet. You desire to be at 6,000 feet. The difference is 9,000 feet. 9,000 multiplied by 3 gives you 27 miles. The monitoring pilot will set the altitude selector to 5,000 feet. The flying pilot will confirm 5,000 feet Azel White. The flying pilot will select the speed and close thrust to flight idle. The flying pilot will then adjust the speed to 250 knots. Please note that at 15 DME you are required to slow down to 210 knots. The flying pilot will set the speed to 210 knots at 18 DME. At 5 DME, you will slow down to 180 knots. Flying pilot will call for flap 9. The monitoring pilot will check the speed and select flap 9. The flying pilot will say set heading 189. The monitoring pilot will subsequently set the heading. Please remember that if autopilot is engaged, the flying pilot will set his own heading. ATC will clear the aircraft for ILS approach when passing overhead Charlie Tango Victor. You will be cleared for an initial approach altitude of 2,000 feet. The monitoring pilot will subsequently set the altitude selector to 2,000 feet. The flying pilot will call ASIL White. When the to from arrow falls to from, the flying pilot will count 3 seconds and then select heading. The aircraft will automatically turn onto heading 189. The flying pilot calls for the course bars to be set to 009. Remember the phrase sources and courses. Our current source remains the same. We will still be making use of VOR Charlie Tango Victor. However, we are now required to set our course onto runway heading. Remember that if autopilot is engaged, the flying pilot will set his own course bars. The aircraft now turns outbound and descends to 2,000 feet. This is an ideal time for the flying pilot to revise his go-around actions. Please note that the flying pilot will then say the following. In the event of a go-around thrust with toga buttons, go-around attitude, flap 9, positive climb, gear up. He will then say, follow the missed approach procedure. It is good practice for the flying pilot to deselect heading. The flight director will then go into roll mode, keeping the wings level. The flying pilot will select intercept angle 30 degrees off of the ILS runway 01. The flying pilot will then say set heading 040. The monitoring pilot will subsequently set the heading. Remember that if autopilot is engaged, the flying pilot will set his own heading. Approaching 9 DME, the monitoring pilot will call approaching 9 DME. The flying pilot will call checked. The flying pilot will then select the heading. The aircraft will commence the turn onto 040. Remember the phrase sources and courses. What is our current source and what is our current course? Our current source is Charlie Tango Victor and our current course is runway heading 009. However, we now require our source to be on Charlie Tango India. The flying pilot then calls for the RMUs to be tuned to Charlie Tango India. The monitoring pilot will subsequently tune the RMUs. Please note that the tuning of the RMUs is only done by the monitoring pilot, as this does not form part of the flight guidance system. Approach can then be armed. Please note that when arming the approach, you will have localizer white, glide slope white, heading green, and altitude green. The monitoring pilot will call localizer live. The localizer will turn green once it has been captured. The flying pilot will then call localizer green. The aircraft will roll out on the localizer. The monitoring pilot will start to look for the glide slope. As soon as it starts to move, the monitoring pilot will call glide slope live. The flying pilot will call checked. At 1.5 dots, the monitoring pilot will call 1.5 dots. The flying pilot will subsequently call gear down flap 22. The flying pilot will then call for the speed to be set to 140 knots. The monitoring pilot will subsequently set the speed. At 145 knots, the flying pilot will call flap 45. He will immediately increase the thrust as drag is added by the flap. The monitoring pilot will confirm flap 45 and confirm it on the ICAS. The flying pilot will call glide slope green, set missed approach altitude. Please note that the above is said when the glide slope has been captured. After the flying pilot has called for the missed approach altitude to be set, the monitoring pilot will set 6,000 feet as per ILS runway 01. The flying pilot will call for the speed to be set. The monitoring pilot will subsequently set the speed. The flying pilot will call for the before landing checklist. The monitoring pilot will conduct the before landing checklist. Please note, the before landing checklist includes the following. The monitoring pilot will call landing gear down 3 greens. The flying pilot will confirm 3 greens. The monitoring pilot will call flap. The flying pilot will confirm flap 45. The rest of the checklist is completed. The monitoring pilot will then call before landing checklist complete. The flying pilot will disconnect autopilot when the runway is in sight. The flying pilot will then hand fly down ILS, monitoring the precision approach path indicators, also known as PAPIs. Please remember the philosophy of in the box, out the box. In the box, check your instruments and ensure that everything is okay. Out the box, look at the runway and ensure that you can still see your PAPIs. After landing, the monitoring pilot will call spoilers open and reverses green. The flying pilot will select reverse and call for reverses green. The monitoring pilot will then call 60 knots. The flying pilot will close the thrust reverses. If the first officer landed the aircraft, the captain will now confirm that he has control. ATC will clear next left to the apron. On clearing the runway, after landing actions are commenced. The locking of controls takes place. You switch the strobe and landing lights off on clearing the runway. Switch the transponder to standby, shed bus to auto, start the APU. Once the APU has been run for 3 minutes, the environmental panel can be selected to what is required. The first officer conducts the after landing checklist. Shutdown flows and shutdown checklist is completed. If the flight has been terminated, the terminating checklist is to be completed as a read and do. This concludes the first briefing. We trust that you have found this to be an insightful and valuable learning experience.